Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining us. It is such a pleasure to have you join us again for the second part of our seminal conversation in the Pan-African forums, where we are setting the ground for several months of discussions. We will be coming to you every month, the first Tuesday of the month at a time just like this. And we will be exploring what it means to look at the world, to think through our many struggles, our many challenges from the identity of being African. On behalf of our hosts, the Elephant, Ifra Nairobi and Alliance Francaise de Nairobi, it is such a privilege to welcome you, whether you're joining us on Zoom or for those of us who are joining us on the live stream, Karibuni Sana, as we say in East Africa. As those of you who joined us last time knows that the Pan-African forums are following up on a series of 4 forums that we did, where we decided to use this historic interregnum to take time to invest in the intellectual labor of creating, in the words of Aikwe Ama in his novel Kent, new narratives of our own making as we move into space of our own choosing, as we dream in images drawn from our people's best desires, as we plan in designs drawn from our own reflection, then make again the universe that might have been, but was not, here in this place, now in this time, freed for our new creation. Hence, in these monthly gatherings, we will engage the practical meaning of the identity African in relation to the range of challenges facing those who identify themselves with Africa as African, wherever they may be in the world. And we're going to explore the range of ideas, realities, challenges, experiences, possibilities, and visions that, as I said, come with using Africa as a basis for collectively imagining and organizing towards the future. For this seminal conversation, we are defining Pan-Africanism. And for those of you who joined us or who have had a chance to listen or follow on the first part of the conversation, we had Brian Kagora, who is not only a Pan-Africanist, but really invested in development governance, coming to us from the standpoint of working in the policy sphere. And we said Brian is a human rights, he's a lawyer generally. And what he did was to start us on this exploration of the concept. We looked at some of the definitions of Pan-Africanism, and we began to tease those out at some of the history that has brought us to this space, and how that history helps us understand the nuances that come with different people's understanding of Pan-Africanism and the different struggles that Pan-Africanism has engaged over the last century or so. We also began to talk through some of the contradictions and nuances, and then eventually we began to tease out what that meant in terms of the present moment. Today we will go on with the conversation, and we will start with 2 respondents, other intellectuals who are sharing their thoughts, they're exploring, nuancing, engaging, beginning perhaps with, I hope, beginning with some of the things that Brian said, but really beginning to explore their own perspectives to what Pan-Africanism means, what it has meant, what it could mean. So the way we're going to organize ourselves today is I'm going to begin by asking our 2 additional guests today to just speak for about 10, 12, 15 minutes, and then we will have a round of questions. So please, as they speak, if you have any question, if you want some clarification, please feel free. If you have a question and you're on the Zoom, please put it in the Q&A, because that could be easiest for me to be able to pick them up. But then you also feel free, if you want to put a comment or a thought or you're reflecting, please use the comments. If you are joining us by live stream, please put it in the comments and we will make sure that we harvest those and also address those questions and comments. And then after that, we will open up the conversation. I'm really pleased that Brian is able to join us, and we'll just have a conversation and listen to the 3 panelists as they go into conversation with each other, but also with you based on your questions and comments. So having heard from this intellectual who is working in the policy sphere, let me introduce the two intellectuals working in the academy and amongst and with the arts in many different ways. Zukiswa Wana is a writer, and Zuki writes in a whole range of forms. She's a journalist. And you will, many of you will probably have come across her essays, her commentaries, her pieces for several newspapers and magazines, both on the continent and elsewhere in the world. She's also a publisher, having founded her own publishing company, Paivapo. And some of you may have recently encountered Zukiswa engaging as the founder curator of Afrolit Son Fortier Festival, which is, I think the latest edition just concluded a couple of days ago. And this one was particularly significant. And perhaps Zukiswa would want to tell us why it was so significant. And maybe let me just give you a chance, Zukiswa, to say good evening from wherever you are and hello to everybody. Welcome.
Good evening, people of African descent, wherever you might be. And thank you very much, Mshai, for the invitation. And to everyone for being here who's managed to get here. Right.
And I have to say,
where do I start? Or am I supposed to start here?
No, I just wanted to say that one of the things I have particularly enjoyed, I just went back and looked at, just dipped into it, was the book. I think most of us know you for your fiction, but I really enjoyed, just going back to your travel memoir. First of all, I love the title, Hardly Working, because even as you're saying you're hardly working, it just seemed you worked so hard in giving us this really interesting glimpse of what a version of Pan-Africanism can look like. So I just wanted to say, Karibu Sana, I'm so excited to have you join us.
Asanteni, but also, you said intellectual. I'm just a cultural worker. Dr. Murunga is the intellectual.
Cultural workers work in very many spheres, and I'm sure we'll come back to that and explore that a little bit more. And so then let me welcome Dr. Murunga. Dr. Murunga is a historian, or as he likes to say, he's a student of history. He's also a political analyst. And currently he's the executive secretary of the Council of the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. I believe he's also just taken on a position with the UN, where he's going to help the UN think about research. Well, not a position, but he's just joined the board, where he's going to help the UN work and think about research in more interesting ways. My brother, it is such a joy and a privilege to have you. Karibu as well.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone who is tuning in. I knew Zukiswa would bring this intellectual thing here because I owe her a trip to Dakar. So can we keep that aside for today?
And I'm just then going to start, since you brought in this idea of being intellectuals, if you could just, each of you, just give me a little glimpse. Last week when we had the conversation, I think one sentiment that I saw reflected in a lot of the chats and a lot of the questions that came up was, where are people working? Like, okay, it's one thing to talk about, as Brian did. Brian laid a fantastic groundwork, as you know, in terms of where Pan-Africanism has come and what the struggle has meant. And particularly, a lot of people got caught up in the politics, in the whole political realm and the ideas of the economy and the development. But people began to ask, okay, what does it look like in some of the other realms? I know there were a couple of questions on education. And then somebody did ask about, okay, what does this mean in the cultural sphere? So before I give both of you a chance to just talk to us a little bit freely, I wonder if each one of you could just give us a little snapshot. What does it mean to be a publisher? What does it mean to be a writer? What does it mean to be a curator of a festival that has this vision of a continent or a people who are beyond the nation states? Perhaps I can start with you, Zukiswa, and then we'll come back and allow you just to wax forth.
Okay, thank you very much for asking that. I've had for a very long time the idea of us speaking across, particularly the linguistic borders, because already as a continent, we don't speak enough. But I also wanted to talk to our siblings in Brazil, in Francophone and Lusophone, just all over the world. And so, for the longest time I had been doing, and you have come to a few of those, I have been doing artistic encounters. And in doing artistic encounters, I was interested in how art can speak to each other across the languages. And so I kicked off that, and that happened for 3 years. And then, of course, COVID happened. But when Corona happened, I thought we could do a little bit more on this, particularly with literature, which is a field that, I know quite a bit about, but not as well as I should. And I know a lot of other Africans do not as much as they should. I don't know how many times I have seen on public platform statement like, oh, there is no humor in African literature. There is no this in African literature. And I'm like, really? So it is thus that I decided to kick off pandemic online festival, if you will, Afro-Lit Sans Frontiers. And initially, I started it looking at writers from Lusophone, from Francophone, and from Anglophone. And they would do whatever their presentations in their languages, they would read, they would interact with the audience. It was absolutely amazing. So we did that for 5 seasons, but I was also very keen on the fact that we weren't having African languages on this platform. I mean, we did maybe in the first one with Lingala, where Richard Alimutu in Congo read something in Lingala, but I was keen to be able to do something. So I went ahead and I asked, and I looked around, and I managed to get a bit of funding. And then finally, I could now say, you know what? Let's have some African languages. And so Afro-Lit Sans Frontiers just did a special African language edition, which ended yesterday. And it's available obviously on our YouTube platform and our website. And we had, the languages we had were Kiswahili, Ewe, Lingala, isiZulu, Hausa, Shona, Yoruba, and Shona ended yesterday. And but I've seen beyond that we've been doing quite a lot of other things in the cultural space. And I think perhaps that may be one way of highlighting how Pan-African conversations can be made, because, for all the animosity, say, for instance, between South Africa and Nigeria, diplomatic stuff, we have also noticed that some of the best musical collaborations have come between these two countries. For all the KOT versus Nigerians on Twitter, we've also seen that some of the greatest collaborations have come from this. So I think maybe the cultural space could be one of the ways that we must consider as our salvation and, in foraging a way forward. We have certainly seen artists like Burna Boy, for instance, making a statement about Zim Lives Matter, Zimbabwean Lives Matter. And in this, I would actually like to state, as I'm starting, that we need to recognize how state power is being used to subdue the voices of self-determination. In Zimbabwe, I understand that Hopo Chingono, who just got arrested again today. In Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Brazil, in South Africa, in Namibia, pretty much everywhere where you can find Black people. And so I think that sometimes what has happened during this time is that there seems to be a young collective voice of people speaking up beyond their national borders. And that to me makes a difference.
As you were speaking, Zukiswa, I remember something Brian said. I was just checking my notes where last week he said, Africa has, Africa can, and Africa will. And so many times people say, well, one reason Africans can't work together is all this linguistic diversity that makes it impossible for them to work together. And so I really appreciate what you just said, that despite all this, it is possible to actually put together a festival where people tune in from all over and people are actually speaking in this huge diversity of languages. I think this week, The Continent put out a special edition, The Continent, which is this online weekly magazine that comes to you. You just get it by WhatsApp. Again, this idea of Africa Can, and this was the first edition edited by Nanjala, Nyabola, which had all these different languages that are spoken on the continent. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, and I'm going to ask you to please let me know, just share your working definition of Pan-Africanism, and then maybe if you can speak to us for another 10 or so minutes from whatever perspective, responding to some of the things Brian said, or in your own thoughts on what that has meant to you and what your experience or your thoughts around it might mean. But before I do that, Gordon, again, I just want to ask more or less the same question, just as a place of setting us down and really beginning to ask questions. You are executive director of a Pan-African, if I may use that word, or shall I say a continental, I don't know how you're going to define it, organization of African intellectuals working in many different disciplines. What does that mean? Would you use the term Pan-African? Would you describe yourself as a Pan-Africanist? What does that space look like, and why does it matter?
Thank you, Shai. I think that at the end of the day, the challenge we have is when we allow the conceptual understanding of Pan-Africanism to hide the reality of Pan-Africanism. The very fact that it's happening, whether we conceptualize it or not, right? The very fact that in real life, there are no distinct categories of a cultural Pan-Africanism from an economic or a political Pan-Africanism. I'm not saying the conceptual is not important. I'm saying that there is a point where the conceptual can give us a misleading impression that you access the political dimension of Pan-Africanism, then you access the cultural dimension of Pan-Africanism, and then you access the economic. And I'm saying this partly because at the core of the question of defining Pan-Africanism is an epistemic issue relating to knowledge. And go back to Brian's very panoramic take on Pan-Africanism last week. And at the core of every successful move towards a Pan-African relationship was the act of imagining the existence of an entity, knit together by the fact of race and related identities. But the deliberate act of imagining that it is possible for African peoples, irrespective of where they are, to forge a commonality, a common thing that assures them that this is their entry point into the very act of being human. Okay? And it took, and Brian made this point repeatedly, it took people to sit down to say deliberately that we want to have a series of conferences, to address the significance of this imagination of having a sense of belonging to a community of people identified as Africans. And even though aircrafts were not as sophisticated then as they are now, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Njomo Kenyattas, all these people were able to link up with George Padmore, Edward Blyden, so that capacity to imagine the possibility beyond the locality that you belong in is, I think, Mshai, what you're asking me to talk about. It is that there is a knowledge question sitting at the heart of this, and the desire to know is core to what Pan-Africanism is. And I think that's what the answer to your question is from a Codesria perspective, that we actually do not have an option but to be Pan-African in orientation. What value is knowledge if it is produced only for Senegal, for Kenya, for South Africa? When the imagination of African peoples over historical time. You want to look at the stories, you want to look at the folklore, you want to look at anything that one can associate with pre-colonial Africa, imagined a world beyond the locality. So I think the epistemic question is what is core, that we cannot but imagine a world that brings together peoples of Pan-Africa, of African origins, African, in its diversity, as an entity that has a role to play in this world. And as Brian demonstrated, due to the experiences of slavery, colonialism, and all this, we've had occasionally to pose Pan-Africanism as a reaction. But actually embedded in that reaction is something much older, better, and we need to imagine it, produce knowledge about it. And that's what we try to do from Codesria.
Thank you very much. And so Zukiswa, then, what does that look like from the arts, from the sphere of working with culture, from the sphere of working with people from all over the continent in the unique way that the arts allow us to do?
I think the arts perhaps allow us to just free our minds and essentially go wild and see what we can do. They also allow us to question, and part of questioning is being able to stand in solidarity with each other. Right at the beginning, when earlier this year, when the George Floyd incident happened, quite a few friends and I, a few writer friends and I got together, and we decided that we're going to write an African letter protest, a support letter by African writers in support of Black Lives Matter. What was interesting in this particular exercise is when we let the letter out, and we very deliberately, for anyone who'd read it, it was in quite a few spaces, for anybody who'd read it, they would have realized that we're questioning not just what had happened in America to Black lives, but we're also highlighting how Black lives don't seem to matter in Brazil and here on this continent. Police were supposed to protect and serve and oppose. And so in now this letter, one of the criticisms came out, it's from young Africans who said, well, you're talking about America, but why don't you talk about everything that is I left this particular message because it was during the Black Lives Matter protest, because pretty much everybody who had spoken up in that platform, from Amatai Du, from to the young people right across everybody in that platform would letter actually being very consistent. How landscape is helping, highlighting really that there is more than just one thing, but beyond that, it's also being able to learn your voice. Can everybody else hear me? Okay, so it's also being able to learn your voice to a position and being able to say, as I was saying to somebody else some time ago, they said to me, well, you choose to use your voice, but not every artist needs to. I said, no, not every artist needs to, but perhaps I realize that my readers are all over the continent, and if any of them are injured, I am also injured. So an injury to one is essentially an injury to all. And so it's worth recognizing that. It's worth recognizing whether you're a musician, you're a dancer, you are any form of cultural worker, that your audience are the people next door to you, that everybody. And so you need to learn your voice where you're able to, And yeah, so that's what it means to me.
Would you like to speak a little bit about, have you had challenges? Have you had any time when you've questioned if this way of working, when you're thinking across a continent or across an identity, is problematic? Or is difficult to do?
I personally don't find it problematic. Perhaps the only challenges that I get, and this is something that we have been talking at length and thinking about doing something about, is where, I always say, as far as I'm concerned, the US was made through the arts, They had Hollywood. So every time you watch the movie, the hero was always an American, and then whoever was a bad guy was whoever America thought was an enemy at that time. The prize for journalism is the Pulitzer. Everybody looks at it. When somebody wins a Pulitzer, then it's like, oh wow. The Grammys are supposed to be the thing in music. The Broadway is supposed to be their thing in theater. And so you need to start, I think as a continent, we need to start thinking about how do we invest in the arts? So that we have our cultural voice. Because if some other entity from outside keeps sponsoring the artistic events that I'm doing, sometimes I might be forced not to say anything about things that I oppose, that I see are hurting my fellow siblings in their own world, whether in another country, that is funding it. So we need to find a way of how to do it. I do realize, however, the danger of cultural workers and the danger of anybody in the arts in general. And that's probably the reason why a few of our not very clever governments have been talking about the scrapping of humanities in universities, and so when we recognize that these are the people who will question, these guys are worried about their power. At the end of the day, there's a word in Nguni, Izinduna. At the end of the day, our presidents, a lot of our political leadership appear to be something that Brian said in the last thing. They appear to be Izinduna. They appear to be middlemen for Western or Eastern capital, but never for us who are within. They, so anytime anything happens, they want, the American ambassador must speak, this other person must speak, but they never listen to our voice, and they justify their actions to the US, they justify their actions to the UK, even when they're showing their wrath. Oh, I can't believe that you're doing this. This is neocolonialism. They always say that to the West. And even when we do something, when we question the way they do things, they do not believe that we are intellectually capable enough. And this is something that Brian, also I touch on something that he said. They do not believe that we're intellectually capable to be able to criticize. So constantly they're like, who is funding you? Because it's absolutely impossible for us to see how the misfortune and the dangers and the problems that they're giving us. As far as they're concerned, we must be funded from somebody else. So it is very necessary, as Brian mentioned last time, for our leadership as we go forward, for them to know the history of, to know Africa as a place of history and creativity and intellectual contribution consistently. One of the most quoted intellectual presidents on this continent, famous for some I'm an African speech, taken from Agre, obviously, Agre of Africa, was also very famous for quoting dead white men when he was doing speeches. W.B. Yeats, Winston Churchill, and so forth and so on. And you'd wonder to yourself, this man who says he's an African, who talks about how Africa is a place of intellect, does he not know any African intellectuals? And so perhaps just to end this little bit of section on intellectualism, my Sierra Leonean brother, Ishmael Bear, who writes in his book, The Radiance of Tomorrow, and he talks about how African presidents talk about mountains and rivers as though they're the ones who built them. You know, they talk about the wildlife as though they're the ones who gave birth to the wildlife, but they don't actually tell us what their achievements are in the course of their leadership. And so perhaps we need more of this. We need intellectual engagement from them, but also we need practical engagement. We need to see them saying they believe in this continent and the Black world enough that they don't go to hospitals in Europe or in Asia when they get sick, which is perhaps the greatest equalizer that the pandemic has given, because now they currently need to be in our countries, within our borders, and maybe utilizing the same hospitals that we do. So yeah, that's where I'll end it for now.
I like where you've ended, because you talk about the importance of the intellectual work that we are doing, whether we're working in whatever sphere of work you're doing, but that it has got very real and practical implications in people's everyday life. Because, so again, going back to some of the comments that we had at the first part of the conversation, were people saying, okay, but how does this really help us? What if I embrace this identity? What practical effect has it had historically on African peoples? And I know Brian spoke a lot to that, but also right now in the present moment. Godwin, what were some of your thoughts when you listened to Brian, or some of your thoughts in general that you would like to share with us at this point?
Let me isolate maybe 2 to 3 points that I would like to suggest we think about a little bit. And obviously, the first point that I thought was very interesting out of Brian's presentation was the point I started with, which has to do with Pan-Africanism as a product of imagination. Essentially, in Edward Blyden's words, you know, that the notion of the African personality. And I think that each time we talk about Pan-Africanism and we listen to especially younger generations of us, you know, who talk about Pan-Africanism, we carry a doubt about the value of Pan-Africanism on the basis of the question, on the assumption that, first of all, it's merely a historical thing. Number 2, that there is no practical validity to it today. It doesn't put food on the table and things like that. And every time I hear that, my own reaction to it is that isn't it exactly a failure that we have refused to imagine Pan-Africanism into existence so that it fulfills our own lives and challenges today, right? Brian mentioned the famous quote from Frantz Fanon: every generation must, out of relative obscurity, define its mission, fulfill it or betray it. And each time I hear people talk about Pan-Africanism in a dismissive way, wondering whether it brings food on the table, I do not think of it as a failure of Pan-Africanism, the historic Pan-Africanism. I think of it as a failure of successive generations of Africans to imagine their mission and fulfill it, right? The reason is simple. The reason is that the people who imagined Pan-Africanism into existence through the conferences and related activities were confronting a reality, the reality of slavery, the reality of racism, the reality of colonialism, the reality of neo-colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah's book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, suggests to me that they imagined into existence something that gave, back to Zukiswa's word, solidarity to African peoples across the world, across the continent. So the challenge is with us. Have we imagined into existence something that gives us a sense of purpose a sense of identity, a sense of belonging as a group of people. And I guess we repeatedly have to confront the fact that the idea of Pan-Africanism of necessity has to imagine itself into existence on the one hand, while dealing or reacting to forces that do not want it to be realized. So that context is important for me, partly because it forces me to, it actually forces us to begin to imagine suitable ways of thinking about Pan-Africanism. And there's nobody who said that the original format and forms of Pan-Africanism are the only ones. Which is why I always think that, you know, out of one, there must of necessity be many Pan-Africanisms. As long as they are tied together by a certain set of conceptual and ideological instruments that enable us to think forward, both in relation to realizing our desires in life as Africans, but also for the development of Black peoples across the world. So the centrality of imagination, of creativity to historic Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanism going forward is, for me, extremely important. Part of the challenge of imagining Pan-Africanism into existence, I think Brian talked about this. I don't know if he put it in these particular words, but I think in his discussion, he spoke about the state capture of historic Pan-Africanism, related, of course, to the emergence of the nation states, you know, as a key player in the frameworks of Pan-Africanism that emerge in that putative year of independence, 1960, when we begin to bring the Organization of African Unity and all that, and the state becomes the locus around which we think about Pan-Africanism. And today you walk across the continent and you meet students who tell you about African presidents having captured Pan-Africanism and used it for purposes other than solidarity of African people, other than development of African nations and things like that. And again, the founding fathers and mothers of Pan-Africanism did belong within nation states, but had a capacity to imagine something bigger than the nation state. Heroic acts of people that we can remember. Julius Nyerere refusing to proceed towards independence unless Kenya and Uganda attained their independence. And many other examples that we can find across the continent of people who understood that continental unity was key to realizing the reality of a Pan-African state for peoples of Africa. And this went beyond Africa. People maybe might not remember that the graves of some of the serious thinkers around Pan-Africanism can be found in Africa. Du Bois buried in Accra would be one good example. So yes, state capture of Pan-Africanism is a challenge to that imagination that I spoke about. But just like colonialism and slavery was a challenge, and our forefathers and mothers imagined the Pan-African out of this, I think the challenge for us that Fanon placed at the table is the challenge of us imagining something beyond this state capture. The final point I would like to mention, Mshai, is that at the moment, I think we are struggling with realities, especially economic realities of life, that we just haven't thought of in Pan-African terms. One of the greatest blueprints for Africa's development was the Lagos Plan of Action. and read that document. At the core of that thinking of these people was self-reliance for African peoples. And they tried to imagine institutions that would facilitate self-reliance for African peoples. And this was a vigorous, carefully thought through process. We don't realize that a part of the mandate of the Africa Development Bank had something to do with the realization of self-reliance. Mwalimu Nyerere spent all his time, working around self-reliance. And we can mention a whole range of other people who did this. What was the counter to the Lagos Plan of Action? It was a carefully crafted neoliberal onslaught on all the important institutions that would have enabled a Pan-African conversation. And today we sit and we think about the neoliberal approach, the marketization and of the continent in a framework that does not satisfy the goal for self-reliance, but we hardly think of it in the context of the fact that it was a deliberate onslaught on the Lagos Plan of Action. So my point is that if then we have to begin to think about Africa's development and we want to slot self-reliance as a core tenet, among others, of what we seek to achieve, where do you go for ideological weapons to effectively fight that fight, if not in historic imagination of Pan-Africanism? Why was it so dangerous that Africa implemented a tool of development centered on self-reliance, right? So it is not true that our forefathers and mothers who imagined Pan-Africanism did not think creatively about what was good for Africa's development. And in politics, in culture, and in economics, one can identify strands of thinking that would form the basis of a new or a slightly different thinking about Pan-Africanism that is in tune with contemporary challenges of the continent. And later on, if allowed, I will come in and try to identify what are the enablers of Pan-Africanism that we sit with today, that we've simply failed to imagine into existence so that we can begin to build blocks that help us grow that solidarity that Zukiswa was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and I'm curious to hear what Brian might say about that. And before I bring in Brian, I have a question from Simiyu Baraza, and I think listening to both of you, this is something, and also came back a lot last time, just in terms of the comments, maybe not quite articulated as a question, but his question to you is, if Gordon and Zukiswa, if Pan-Africanism starts with the imagination, and I think both of you have made that very clear, it starts with the imagination, it starts with thinking through, it starts with that intellectual work. How then do we move into it, into real practical terms? How, both in the arts and in audiences, beyond just keeping it in the realm of the ideas, the realm of the ideals and all that. Gordon, you said, for instance, that there was the Lagos Plan of Action, and then there was pushback. And then for many people, it seemed, okay, that was it, it died. And isn't that part of the problem of Pan-Africanism? That it always seems to be in this space of the mind, in this space of vision, in this space of possibility, but it doesn't seem possible to actually move that into action, at least not in the present moment. I know Brian talked about last time, and it was, I think for me, really interesting to hear him say, this is what a Pan-African, I think the 6th Pan-African Congress, this is what they said they wanted to do, this is what they said they wanted to achieve, and here you can see how they translated that. But it seems that once we got past that point, we've stayed very much in this realm of talking, in this realm of issuing statements, in this realm of thinking, but we don't seem to be able to move it into action.
Might take that.
Go ahead.
I'm always in the realm of fiction. So I can only speak for literature, which is where I am. And one of the things that I have
Okay, so I'm having some problem hearing you. I don't know if anybody else. Okay, it's better now.
On books, for instance, you know, and one. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes, now I can.
So one of the things that I've noticed publishers on this continent do is do co-publishing deals. Hello?
Yes. Hello, Zukiswa?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, so co-publishing bills.
So I've noticed that's one of the things that I've noticed, where, because we know that if I am crossing into JKIA with a whole bunch of books from Nigeria, I will probably be told that I can't cross over with them. And so instead of crossing with all those books from JKIA, a publisher from Nigeria who I'm working with will just say, hey, why don't you print this in Kenya, and then you can start making a noise before my artist comes over to Kenya. You see, so that is one way. That is in South Africa, publishers and Wuza Press in Rwanda certainly doing it. But I also know that there has been like very real efforts at translating across languages. And I think here of Etale in Mozambique. And I also know quite a few publishing house in Cameroon. So these things are already happening. And I know for a fact that one of the projects that I'm working on, the translators are going to be Black Brazilians and Black French people, French-speaking people. So that is already something that is happening. So I can only speak for literature, which is where I am in. I can't say much for other fields, but I do know, obviously, one of the perhaps most little thought about, but that actually is a real thing, is cross-border trading, which we see so many times. You know, a few years ago, when the African Union laughingly decided that they were going to give their presidents AU passports, I kept thinking, if they wanted to see whether these AU passports would work, they should have given it to the women who do cross-border trading. Those are the people who need them, you know? But yeah, so certainly there are some spaces, and as I mentioned earlier, obviously the other area of where I've seen collaborations is in music, you know, quite a bit, as well as in film. There's been a lot of interest in film. So I think maybe to Simiyu, who is a filmmaker, he can also start thinking about how to work with other filmmakers, say from Uganda. Is production costs lower in your work with each other so that things are easier in your particular field?
I really love that example, because one of the things I am aware, there was a time when the joke among African artists was that we travel to other continents so that we can meet each other. I know that is certainly true for storytellers and for theater people, but now more and more people are beginning to figure out ways of making sure that not only can they invite and find ways of whatever it takes to bring artists from other countries into their own country and not wait for other people to make that possible. But also, as you said, beginning to find real practical ways of doing work together. And one of the amazing things that has happened as a result is that other fields, other professions are beginning to learn from those ways of working together and beginning to come up with really positive ways of acting together, so that we're beginning to see the arts modeling this this way of working together across common challenges for the benefit of everybody. Godwin, did you want to say anything to that particular question?
I'm shy, to be honest, I actually do not feel like the challenge of Pan-Africanism is one of moving from ideas to action. I just do not accept the premise of that suggestion. I would say that the challenge of Pan-Africanism is a challenge of either validation or legitimation. And I would like to see if I can see how this is happening. At every level I can think about across the continent, there are pockets of Pan-Africanist things happening, right? Let's take the example of, Zukiswa is using the example of giving the women who cross borders, selling things and all that. They call it smuggling. When you pick an item on the Kenyan side of the border and cross over into Uganda without going through the state structures, they call it smuggling. Actually, this is just simply a problem of naming. Because for years and years, what is described as smuggling has been happening without being named smuggling. And Brian made this point. Brian talked about the need for us to find a language to describe the things we do. Borders have never been as sacrosanct as we think they are from our elite vantage points, right? The first thing I do when I need to cross the border to another place is to look for a passport. This is not the reality of most Africans. It's not the reality of most Africans. Zukiswa will remind me of the gentleman whose book we discussed at Alliance Française sometime. Was it Goethe Institute, I remember. A refugee from Sudan who walked all his way from Sudan to Pretoria, manipulating all the systems that he could manipulate successfully, And so for me, the challenge is a challenge of validation of the things that we practically have been doing over years. Other than at the political level, where state structures have been erected to prevent rather than enable the actual to enable living Pan-Africanism on the continent, right? You come across a whole range of examples. The levels of consciousness about an entity called Africa, irrespective of the difficulties of language, of territories, of any of those things that you want to think about, irrespective of all those, the levels of consciousness of the reality that there exists an entity called Africa will be found in African music.
Yeah.
And while they experience a whole range of challenges, right, it has not stopped them from imagining something bigger than South Africa, something bigger than Egypt, right? In fact, the connection between Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism is so well negotiated at the borders in West Africa, in the Sahel, that, what is lacking is actual political institutions that give life to what already is existing. And one would go so far as to say that the nature of the state, but also the nature of our politics, is clearly stuck against a reality that must eventually happen. The reality that most people on the continent do realize that Uganda is too small for them, that Tanzania is too small for them. And at the end of the day, what has been happening in our life when we are alive has been a tendency to loosen boundaries in whichever way possible, right? So I would say that our challenge is a challenge of finding a suitable language and suitable enablers that help us to validate some of the transgressions that people in Africa have erected against against being hemmed into limited locales like Kenya and all this. Otherwise, if it was not like that, and maybe Brian could speak to this, Sally Mugabe from Ghana, right? Living a reality of anti-colonialism in Zimbabwe, right? And this was not an isolated incident. There are villages in Tanzania where the ANC organized insurrection against the apartheid regime. I mean, think about how difficult it was then to cross boundaries, and ask ourselves, what is making it more difficult today for us to, you know, to mount insurrections against these boundaries? So it's more a question of growing the consciousness. For me, it's more a question of validating practices that not only do we know are happening, but the state knows it, they are happening. We need to spend a little bit of time thinking about the character of the Sahel, for instance. The areas where we had the great empires of Ghana, the place where manuscripts written in original indigenous forms existed for years, and how the adversities of colonialism and the, you know, like the repeated battering of people in that region has not neutered them completely to the point where they continue to fight today. You just need to go to Burkina Faso to see the tenacity. And Macron learned this when he visited Burkina Faso. Young university students mounting the stage and telling him as he ought to hear, something that the presidents cannot say. And I'm just saying that there is already a life going on that is Pan-African in orientation, that imagines something bigger than Burkina Faso, that imagines something bigger than Mali, right? Even in its very nature, the people who are trekking out of so-called poverty into the, you know, into they just haven't figured out a suitable way of enabling it. So I do not think that Pan-Africanism has remained at the level of ideas. And I think there are too many examples. Barasa would know, even in the area of film, examples that you can put on the table to show advances that have been made that give a feeling and a sense of the possibilities there are of enacting a Pan-Africanism beyond simply being an idea.
I think we can say that Africa, what you both of you are saying is that Africans are already living beyond the nation states and have been doing that for a very long time. I'm going to ask Brian if he wants to say anything, both in relation to that comment, but just generally from the conversation so far. But before I do that, let me just read a comment and a question from Habil Ondiek, which, Gordon, I think you've already answered, but then, you know, Brian might also want to add something to this. Habil says, culture plays an important role in unifying people, and we know that's why colonizers went to great lengths in order to erode African culture. Modernization has further fueled abandonment of our culture in order to fit in the global village. Language, as we know, is an important component of culture. So what lessons can we learn from Jerusalema song done in the Sizulu language becoming a global hit? And I know you already began speaking to that. Brian, as you come in, would you like to comment on that or just build on any of the thoughts that Godwin and Zukiswa have shared with us so far?
Yeah, I would like to avoid the Jerusalemization of Pan-Africanism. But I think that something perhaps related to that question is, Haile Selassie made a speech, excuse me, at the 1963 conference. Haile Selassie made a speech that had the following lines. I want to see if the listeners can know where they remember this speech from. Until the philosophy that holds one race superior to another is utterly and completely destroyed, everywhere there will be war. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Africa, unite, right? Let's unite together to fight against our imperialism. Now, many people don't remember this speech from Haile Selassie. They remember it. Haile Selassie's speech was about 38 minutes. A young Jamaican storyteller called Robert Nesta Marley broke this down into about 3-4 songs. The rest of the world, from Japan to China, dances to this. It still remains some of the most popular songs. Very few realize that these were excerpts from a speech made at the very first OAU conference. Why do I say this? I think that we are shy, and thank you, Godwin, thank you, Zukiswa. I mean, we couldn't have had two greater minds to start off this discussion after last week, right? And Godwin raises the issue of validation and legitimation, and Zukiswa raises the issue of solidarity and voice. And if you spin the imagination question that Godwin raises, and you think about why is it difficult for this generation to imagine Pan-Africanism that they think is practical for them, it's partly the neoliberalism has reduced all our imagination into 5 things: money, power, sex, faith or spirituality, and info, not even knowledge. And the media pervades these things. So part of our problem is if it doesn't have sex appeal, you don't know it exists. It doesn't make you money, you don't know it exists. And much of what Godwin was talking about, Lagos Plan of Action, are transformative ideas. So I want to suggest that as we take on the ideas that Zukiswa and Godwin have given us, whilst we appreciate the exigencies of everyday existence, the difference between Africa, India, and China at the present moment, and even America, is China has a 100-year plan for Africa. India has a 50-year plan for Africa. These are long-term transformative perspectives. They may change over time. It may be too ambitious to plan over 100 years. But anything that's not driven, as was the Lagos Plan of Action, by a long-term integrative structural transformation that factors in what we do with culture. So we're not imagining culture for today, we're imagining culture and how to deploy it in our self-development, in our self-reliance, is we will keep on being tentative because short-termism does not cure historical discrimination, marginalization, exclusion. And that's why, as an African, Godwin will know, I have consistently refused the notion of a global village and indicated to them that it's neither global nor village. It is thus a space dominated by one culture that deploys itself as the only culture. And that counter narrative that says we actually do exist and we see life differently and we have a right to see life differently as persons of African descent, as Africans, is what we have been deprived. And Godwin describes how power has been used, coup d'etats that I talked about last week, assassinations, if you read the Economic Hitmen, all sorts of things. Zukiswa talked about how Hollywood has deployed its power and might in the media. Even when you have brilliant African Americans and actors of Black descent. They are marginalized in roles. They don't constitute what becomes what are heroes. And we cannot sit around there from shy and complain, right? I think everybody says, oh, we need to be objective. We're in danger of becoming racist. We're in danger. I'm sorry. I'm wearing a very colorful shirt today because I want to make this point, right? The red and the blue on my shirt are not fighting, right? And the blue is not apologizing for being blue. And I'm sick and tired of arriving in a place, trying to be acceptable to everybody, apologizing for my Blackness, trying to be courteous about how my people were enslaved, trying to be courteous about how my people were colonized, how Congolese people were taken and kept in cages in Belgium, how the British used to give each other Africans as presents, and so on and so forth. No, it's my reality. And I'm not going to start a question about universality that requires me to grow political amnesia. So, and any honest way of building forward actually says, my culture is not just about making money. My culture is not just about food on the table. Because humanity is much more than that. And because everybody reduces us into food, that's why the gifts they give us is to build Blair toilets. As though the only thing that Africans need is to get primary education, eat, and then use Blair toilets. I'm about a much more radical sense of who we are. A wealth, and that's why I like Zukiswa's idea about our ideas, our thoughts, and just being intellectual, not just intellectual, but being creative, not just creative, being owners. Because one of the things Africans have been persuaded is this idea that as long as you're making money, you're serving, you're working somewhere, or someone calls you an entrepreneur, but we own neither the geographic space where we exist, because it's been taken over by everybody else, nor the intellectual space, as Godwin has said, because it's highly contested by many people, nor the creative space, because we are not investing sufficiently in our creative space, nor the spiritual space, because we have become totally, if you like, colonized even in that space. So, Mshai, I think I like what these two colleagues have said about Pan-Africanism. And it's not, and Godwin is totally right, Mshai. There are many practical Pan-African things happening. Many I cannot even begin to enumerate, from architecture to music to film there is an awakening. And this particular moment, because of the anti-Black racism campaigns that Zukiswa talked about, the George Floyd stuff, is a moment that's akin to no other in history, where people are openly talking about historical and current racism, whether in foreign policy, in development policy, in multilateral institutions. And what we are learning from hearing about racism in the UN, at the World Bank, in companies, and so on and so forth, is that Pan-Africanism was not being hindered by just the lack of imagination. There were structures intended to retain and institutionalize white supremacy in education, structures in health, structures in global development. And unshackling these structures, Mshai, takes a lot more than us just doing small little things as each individual. That's why Godwin's point is very powerful, that and Zukiswa makes the same point, that not only are our siblings everywhere, it is the same people who dominate global economy, global media and arts, are the same people who historically have thought of us not as equals, but thought of us as hewers of wood and carriers of water, as slaves, as subhuman. And asserting our equal humanity, I think, is something we must do consciously, unapologetically, but as Godwin has said, there are many enablers that we're seeing in many spaces. And I think it's useful for us not to accept a Western standard of judging success as the basis of where we start in judging whether Pan-Africanism is delivering. Otherwise, we will be reduced into consumerist Pan-Africanism and not transformative Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to read a couple of comments because I think that actually are speaking. We truly are in a conversation here. SK on YouTube, and I'm going to give you the comments, and then there is a question, or rather a set of questions that I'm going to ask as one question, and I think all of these are in conversation with each other. SK on YouTube reflects that decades of independence, after decades of independence, we now have a public forum in which to address Africa's problems from a unified perspective within Africa. Long before some politicians began powwowing about integration, Sheikh Anta Diop had been canvassing for a timely federation of African states. And then he further notes that aspects of Diop's legacy made a convincing case for solemn-centeredness, Africanized Egyptology or chematology. And then Karani says, in my opinion, here is what we should embrace. 1, naming our children with African names. 2, learning and prioritizing our mother tongues and African languages. 3, entrenching African values and culture to our generations by all means. Our love for Western lifestyles and comforts always make us pursue Western niceties at the expense of Pan-Africanism. However, Gilbert Munyambu reflects and asks these questions. Is Pan-Africanism an essentialist ideology exclusive only to Africans native to Africa, or does it accommodate Africans of other non-native races? Secondly, if it accommodates non-native Africans, where does it place them? And what role does it assign them within the emancipatory agenda that it advocates? And finally, if Pan-Africanism is an essentialist ideology focused on the liberation of people of the Black race, how does it compare itself with and learn from other similar essentialist ideologies to avoid some of their negative attributes, such as othering of other racial groups, scapegoating, blaming external factors for all problems, ignoring local agency, and turning a blind eye to intra-racial power imbalances while wholly focused on external factors? So I think it's this tension between, okay, this is what we are, this is who we celebrate, this is who we center, and then what about everybody else? And I think we talk a little bit about what happens when you bring race onto it. I think we have perhaps lost Zukiswa for the moment. I hope we'll be able to get her back. But Godwin, do you want to start? And your thoughts on this, and then I'll bring in Brian.
Shai, those were, I mean, like a whole range of questions. So it's not even, I'm not even sure where to start.
I think the first couple were just comments, but then this question of what does it mean when you say, is Pan-Africanism, is it essentialist? And also, does it other anybody who is not of African ancestry? And if so, what are the implications of it?
You know that the conversation around othering is one for which Africa is on the receiving end rather than on the giving end. And perhaps what makes Pan-Africanism a lot more inclusive, I would say, is precisely the fact that it doesn't have the option of othering in the sense in which othering has been done previously. Again, I think this was Brian's starting point last week when he essentially drew the conversation of Pan-Africanism as emerging from a whole range of connecting points that brought peoples of African descent from all over the world, from wherever they came from. So it is not about exclusivity of African peoples on the continent. Rather, it's actually been a very rich conversation between people of African descent across the world, among themselves, but also between them and others. My dates fail me now, but the original NAACP the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, emerged out of the framework of the progressivist movement in the US. People meeting in Niagara and beginning to say, look, we're doing really badly. We need to begin to think about how to make these moves. I would guess in the second half of the 19th century, conversations among white, Black people who are interested in a different, dispensation other than the racist dispensation that they lived in. And that history has continued all the way. Michael Chege did publish a very interesting piece some time ago in the journal Transition, where he was taking stock of the capacity of African peoples to see beyond race, to see the values that inform positions that different people took about the struggles of Africans. The attainment of civil rights in the US was itself a conversation between people of different races, and a lot of the things that happened there inform Pan-Africanism. So it's really difficult to sustain an argument of essentialism, precisely because what we understand today as Pan-Africanists as elements of everything that people packaged as good for humanity, right? The world in which we live in at the moment, even though Mafeja said Africanity is a comparative ontology. You are forced into this thing precisely because of what the rest of the world has defined you as an African. But in fact, the reality that you want, and I think at the core of Pan-Africanism is that desire for a much better world. That does not take away from the point that Brian is making, because in its essence also it is a reaction against years of exploitation, years of harm, years of extremely condescending attitudes towards African people. And so what Africans have been doing is to negotiate that difficult terrain of what the world has loaded over to them in order to find something that is as close to what humanity deserves as better. And this is not our attempt to sanitize Pan-Africanism in any way. It's just that at the end of the day, what people are trying to do in imagining a Pan-African world is to make the simple point to the world that the world has refused to accept the reality of Africans being human, and yet in everything we do, every evidence we have, what is it that isn't human about us? And so I agree with Brian that there are no apologies to be made around some of these questions.
Brian, would you want to add anything, or do you feel that Gordon's covered that pretty well?
I think that Gordon has covered this pretty well. I just wanted to give the date that he referred to. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples was established almost over 111 years ago on the 12th of February, 1909, by a group that involved W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White, Ovington, Moorfield Story, Ida B. Wells, and etc. And it was an interracial group, actually, that aimed at eliminating racial discrimination and racial hatred, and also achieving equality of all persons on political, social, and economic factors. I think that the bigger question for us, Mshai, is a simple one. I heard in 2017, African-American, African migrant, and African actors complaining about awards in Hollywood, right? I heard and hear African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Europeans, and Afro-Asians complaining about racial discrimination, institutional racism in 2020. I observe when I travel, and I travel quite a bit, that I am also treated with suspicion simply because I am Black. I read the stories about the ill treatment of Ethiopian maids, Kenyan young ladies in Asia and elsewhere, semi-slave conditions. So I ask myself a very simple question. If this thing that we're calling Pan-Africanism was born in part in order to contest racial hatred and discrimination, especially against persons of African descent, as well as to achieve equality in the political, social, and economic spheres. And we're still struggling with these things, whether we're in America, I'm sitting in South Africa, these are big issues, and across the world. What should this generation do to deal first with that issue, put it to bed, right? Then the second thing, Mshai, is, you know, if those of you who follow English soccer will notice that people are wearing the poppy flower this week, which is a celebration of Armistice Day, November 11. Because these poppy flowers were apparently very popular in the Western Front when they were fighting in World War I. Now, Msha, I said this last week. World War I was fought decades before Africa was liberated, right? How is it that Western cultures give themselves the latitude to remember and memory, and they use this memory as a never again principle? And for some reasons, Africans think that 55 years is too long for us to be remembering. It is important for us to know how this political elite that's taken over our states have failed in grand corruption, in ethnicity, and so on, the tribalism, and so on and so forth. But Mshaya, I think that it's useful for us not to pretend that the empire died with independence, that the post-colony arrived with Black majority rule. If we do this, we'll be politically naive, right? We will be actually, and this is what bothers me about African intellectualism within the middle class. This idea that things are so bad in Africa that the only thing that's gone wrong is that we allowed colonialism to leave, right? And we took over. And then there's absolutely no attention paid to the context of the globe. That's why I was at pains last week to explain the global financial architecture, the power of the chief executives of pharmaceuticals and big companies. Everybody else in the world can see that power has been reconfigured. And Africans, for some reason, were refusing to see the reconfiguration of global power and its impact at the local level, in development, in the arts, and in everything else. So without excusing ourselves, Mshai, I think that as Gordon answered the essentialism question, I think that what we also need to answer is the exceptionalism question. I hear countries that are older than Africa saying we're a young democracy, right? And we've got to ask ourselves, what is a young democracy? And what does it take to build beyond where we are? And what does that, if you like, integrative, transformative regionalism look like? And that is where a lot of things are happening by themselves. They are happening practically, but there is an overinvestment into localism that we're seeing amongst the political elite and some of our intellectuals, that you actually don't get it. That our shores have so many Chinese, have so many Turkish and Russians. Everybody sees global opportunity. And for us, we're refusing to go global to see opportunities in these other continents. But we cannot exploit those opportunities in those other continents if we don't unite and we don't leverage. We simply will wait to be plucked. We'll wait for others to come and exploit our resources and exploit us. We ourselves are not becoming, we're not projecting ourselves in that self-reliant growth that Godwin was referring to. But even when we use our voice, we're not becoming transformative and global in our imagination. We are allowing colonial language barriers to restrain us, which is why I like Zukiswa's point that it is not just French and Portuguese that we must be speaking to each other about and through. We must imagine valorizing those other languages. And that's why I think that it's important. So for me, yes, language and culture, but I'm hoping in this conversation, we'll bring the question of humanities and science as integral to African transformation. Not just science alone, but humanities and science. Business and public sector, not just private sector alone. If we don't imagine African society in that holistic way, we'll keep on coping, regurgitating failed solutions from the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really regret that Zukis was having internet problems, so she's been unable to reconnect back. And as we come to an end, and maybe she will be able to come in right at the end, I really, really hope so. I do have a couple of just final questions. So I'm going to ask both of you to be thinking just your last word, but also if you can speak to these questions. And by the way, I think, Godwin, the book you were talking about was Johnny Steinberg's A Man of Good Hope, if I'm not wrong, about the man who walked all the way from Somalia and just walked his way right down to South Africa. Yeah, which is a fascinating story. But the two questions that I have, Atika Uhaju is asking, comment unifier des africanités à langage différent? How do we unify Africanities with different languages? So back to the question of language and culture that I think Zukiswa started us off. And then Godwin, you teased us with this, so I'm not going to let you go without you having to answer this question, and both of you are welcome to share some thoughts. What are the enablers of Pan-Africanism? Brian? Godwin? I think, yeah, either of you. First, the question of languages. Again, how do we work across these languages? And I'm really, really pleased that somebody's listening and sending us questions in French. And then especially, what are the enablers of Pan-Africanism as we come to an end? Okay, both of you seem to be thinking very, very hard. Let me invite Brian.
I was waiting for Godwin.
He looked like he's taking notes and writing very furiously.
Yeah, I was waiting for Godwin to answer. So what I was going to say is simple. Last week, I made reference to Kiswahili and how Swahili emerged without the Western language schools, without some of the things that we see as barriers. I think that the Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone challenge is essentially an urban challenge. The majority of our rural populations, even in so-called French-speaking countries, do not speak French. That is why some people from Ivory Coast and their relatives in Ghana and Burkina Faso and Co. can communicate perfectly, although they come from Anglophone and Francophone traditions. And it seems to me that what we have done ourselves as a disprivilege is that we have refined the fight over the Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone question, but we've not actually taken note of the fact that Lusophone and Anglophone Mozambique share certain languages that are indigenous to those countries. And that during the war, most people were able to communicate across those divides, right? That Anglophone and Lusophone countries in the Great Lakes, some of them use Swahili and Lingala and understand each other. So it seems to me that the investment in indigenous languages and in greater movement of people and their ability to connect using their languages. Mind you, we migrated from, most of us, from the same places. And so when we begin to speak to each other in our own indigenous languages, we begin to notice similarities. So I, for example, will tell you, if I'm in Rwanda, people say, I want chakunwa. Chakunwa is chekunwa in Shona, and so on and so forth. And this means the same thing. It's easier to negotiate the linguistic difference through our indigenous languages than it is through the foreign languages. That's number one. And this is not to say we should forget that we're colonized and we speak English and French and so on and so on. It's simply to say that we should actually give pride of place to some of our indigenous languages. And that's why I hail South Africa, Zimbabwe, and all those governments that have actually started teaching Swahili in their schools, so that you make it easier for Africans to communicate. The second thing, though, I also wanted to say about the enablers. You know, one of the things that's moving Pan-Africanism is technology. Technology is joining young people. Technology enables young people to interpret and translate what the other is saying. So you can write something in French and somebody will quickly use Google Translate or some other translation. You can write it in English. So technology is an enabler, but it's just a tool, right? Number two is literature, music, film, right? We're seeing the power of the artistic to drive Pan-African integration across linguistic barriers like no other time. But what we are also seeing is science, right, related to technology. Science is beginning to build a curiosity and interest and a collaboration across African territories. And a common interest is being, I think, fashioned. The third that we are seeing as a driver of Pan-Africanism is we're seeing actually social Pan-Africanism, solidarity, people associating with the struggle of young Burkinabes, young Ivorians, young Malians, just because they are able through social media and other forms to understand what they are fighting for, and they're able to amplify and associate with those struggles. So the voice that Zukiswa was talking about, academia, knowledge. I think that for years, thinkers from across the linguistic divide have always found ways of citing each other, of working with each other. And there's been an integration through Pan-African institutions such as Codestria. We're seeing in Pan-African civil society such as Pan-African Lawyers Union. We're seeing it through institutional mechanisms such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We're seeing this integration happen even within the African Union, where people get to work with each other more, understand this culture. So we're seeing state-based, academic-based, social-cultural-based, but we're seeing, so the enablers of Pan-Africanism from ideas to commerce, which is the last one, we're seeing that business. So when the rest of us are complaining about movement, what has happened because our governments are so obsessed with capital? Is South African capital, whether it's MTN, Standard Bank, South African Broad, is in Nigeria, right? It's in other territories. French capital is in English-speaking countries, right? We're seeing banks, we're seeing breweries, we're seeing other forms of firms. So capital has been able to drive a form of Pan-Africanism. And linked to commerce, we've seen cross-border traders. And that's why for all its limitations, this continental free trade area arrangement needs to be enthused more with the common experience of women cross borders, ordinary artisans, small to medium scale enterprises, and African youth entrepreneurs. Because commerce, when you combine it with all these other endeavors, can have a transformative and developmental component. And if all these are integrated into education and curricula, and we're beginning to see, we started Shikanta Diop as part of Black internationalism, as part of the negritude movement, and so on and so forth. And so we felt, because of the solidarity and the shared ideologies, that we understood something about Senegal, we understood something about Sekou Touré, we understood something even about North Africa. So I would say Pan-Africanism is being driven by a multiplicity of channels, and these channels can become powerful enablers, but we have to be more deliberate in how we strategically deploy them and where we deploy them. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Brian. And I'm really, it's almost like you're reading our minds. I can see Alika has noted that il y a les cas de l'Afrique du Nord qui ne devraient pas être exclus. And I agree, we should not leave out North Africa, and we will in subsequent conversations be bringing intellectuals. And I say intellectuals because these are spaces of us thinking together and intellectuals working from all across the continent and the diaspora. Godwin, I'm going to ask you, and I actually can see even as I was making that request of you, Joko Buthi has added his voice. So please, if you could give your closing remarks, and especially in them address the enablers of Pan-Africanism and how they can be leveraged to meet the needs for the African people.
I kind of have a regret because I allowed Brian to go first, because he basically pulled out everything I have on my list. So, but I'm happy that we actually do agree on these enablers, which are notes I had, at the start of this, and I agree with his conclusion. What is lacking is a deliberate decision to actually formally utilize this as enablers to Pan-Africanism. Occasionally in the regular sense in which they work, but occasionally in an extremely subversive way. For those of you who are listening to us and wondering when this, Pan-Africanism will become alive, I think the point has to be made that the moment when you realize a full Pan-African reality is a moment when you have turned the world upside down. And it's not easy to turn this world upside down. So in any sense, all these enablers should be thought of in an extremely subversive way, because that's the only way to begin to see how Pan-Africanism can occupy its rightful place in molding not just the future for Africa, but in molding the future for the globe. And I think, Brian, of all the enablers you've mentioned, I think the one that I thought needs to be added of is a demographic enabler. A demographic enabler, the emergence of a generation of youthful Africans who, whether they speak English or not, have a language they communicate in. That language might be music, that language might be sports, that language might be science, technology, but it's a language that is really in good hands because of, people have called it the youth bulge and all this. It's a demographic reality. This continent is no longer the continent of people like me, Brian, and Mshai. This continent has moved. And the desire for a deliberateness, I think if we are re-emphasizing the need for a deliberateness, it is precisely because of this demographic reality that often in a lot of literature is treated as a demographic of the poor, of the illiterate, of people who want to move out of the continent and all these kinds of things. But at the heart of it, the demographic that is going to deploy these enablers to transform this continent is going to be this demographic. This demographic has been poorly served by our education system. It has been poorly served by our education system. And the need for a deliberateness is because we need to actually find ways of investing in forms of knowledge that grow that consciousness that Brian was talking about, that grows the solidarity that Brian was talking about, that enables a validation of all those numerous acts of living Pan-Africanism at the local that needs to transcend the local. In other words, I think we should say that this is not a project that that generation will witness the fruits of, but it's a project that definitely has a future that would transform this continent. And I think part of what is missing in the conversation at the policy level is, how do you think about a Pan-Africanism that helps this continent, helps people of African descent across the globe to occupy their rightful place in the world? I think first we must accept that this is a long-term project. We're not in it for us. We're not in it for us. It is a project of building blocks that form the base of a totally different world. And if we've got to do this, and Brian has already talked about the language, I mean, think about it. How many countries are investing in, say, Kiswahili as a common language for the region? How many are doing that? When I go to my Codesria Executive Committee meetings has people who speak a whole range of languages. But because I am schooled in the modern university Francophone, it took me such a long time to realize that I could speak to my colleague from the DRC in Swahili. I did not need the translators to help me speak to this colleague. And so I spent all this time, and then one day he picks up and we start speaking Swahili, and I realized I haven't spoken to this guy, understood where he's coming from and all that, because my education has taught me to think Francophone, Anglophone, or Lusophone. And that's the point that Brian is making, that already the basis for a transformative language that allows us to have our own conversations is there, but we haven't invested in it. So to reiterate, a long-term investment, the need to grow a consciousness, the need to deliberately use these enablers as a basis for a slightly different conversation about Pan-Africanism, a clear desire to bring in an epistemic break that allows us to institute something different from what modern education has given us. And finally, being unceasing in our desire to realize the goals that we set for us, even if those goals are of necessity long-term. Because at the end of the day, the building blocks are the ones that will give us the Pan-Africanism that we seek. So, and finally, I should say that at the end, if some of these building blocks begin to form, the political realization will be forced to follow. Because it's in the nature of the politics of our day that they must be pushed for them to do the right thing. So in some sense, these enablers are an indicator of how to subvert the current forms of politics that we have on the continent. Thank you very much, Shai.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm sure everybody who's joining us on YouTube or is in this webinar with us on Zoom would join me in really sincerely appreciating all three of our speakers. You have given us such an amazing foundation for the conversations that we will be continuing. Zukiswa, speaking from the space of the arts, I regret that due to technological challenges, she wasn't able to complete the conversation with us, but she gave us such a fantastic beginnings, such a fantastic foundation. And Zukiswa, I've seen your message where you say, you know, a text message where you've said, I'm looking forward to being able to catch up with the rest of the conversation when power comes back. So yes, we continue to work with very, very real challenges. Brian, thank you so, so much for joining us, starting us off that great foundation last week. And then Godwin too, for joining us and enabling us to think through, especially this question of the imagination. this question of the intellectual work that has to be done. And both of you reiterating what Fanon said, that it's easy for us to think about Pan-Africanism as something that happened in the past, as people who are enslaved, as people who are colonized, fought for their emancipation. But that reminder that that struggle continues today. And as it continues today, we have to continue thinking our way through practical solutions. And that indeed is what we're going to continue to be speaking about. Our next forum is going to be on December the 1st, Tuesday, December the 1st, the first Tuesday in the month of December. That will be the last one for this year. And we will be taking on, as some people have said, can we start to go into the nuances of different spaces like education, Pan-Africanism and feminism, and so on. And yes, that is the intention. In future conversations, we'll be looking at one aspect and exploring it very, very much. Remember that you will be able to catch both of these, both sessions of this conversation, both on the live stream of Alliance Française, which will stay up on that YouTube channel, and on the Elephant. We'll also be posting the growing reading list. We're harvesting from each month's talks. We'll be adding to that growing list, and you'll be able to find this conversation and the one from last week on the Elephant TV under the videos. Let me thank again every single person who's joining us, both on YouTube and in the webinar. Let me thank the hosts, Alliance Française, IFRAN Nairobi, and the Elephant for this amazing privilege of being able to have a front seat as these conversations continue. And we will meet again as we continue to explore what does it mean to engage with the identity of being African in the 21st century and make a better world out of it. Good night, everybody, until we meet again in December.
Kwaherini.
Iponiowa sura yangu haikuwa na alama hata moja.